She didn't just reject him. She did it in front of 3 billion broadcast viewers. "Father, I'll never choose a human mate," she spat, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the Concordat Hall. Caleb didn't clench his fists in righteous fury. He just sweated through his cheap dress uniform, acutely aware of the squeak his left boot made on the polished marble. Humanity was the galactic joke, and Caleb was the punchline. But punchlines have a funny way of hitting back. The great hall smelled faintly of roasted copper and ozone. It was a sterile, metallic tang that scraped the back of Caleb's throat every time he took a breath. He stood on the raised obsidian dais, the collar of his ceremonial dress uniform digging a harsh red line into his neck. The fabric was heavy, synthetic, and completely unsuited for the sweltering ambient temperature the Concordat preferred. A bead of sweat detached from his hairline, sliding down the side of his nose. He didn't wipe it away. He couldn't. 30 yards away sat King Frederick. Despite the distinctly terrestrial translation of his name, Frederick was undeniably alien. He was tall, impossibly rigid, with pale, almost translucent skin that caught the harsh glare of the anti-grav chandeliers. To his right stood Princess Charlotte. She was draped in layers of iridescent silk that shimmered with microscopic circuitry, her posture a perfect, agonizingly straight vertical line. This was the unity pairing. The treaty mandated it. Humanity got access to the deep space shipping lanes. The Concordat got a symbolic blood tie to the rising primate military. Caleb, largely because he had the right genetic markers and lacked any surviving family to object, was the designated primate. "The union of our houses," King Frederick's voice boomed, artificially amplified without a visible microphone, "signifies the end of the frontier skirmishes. It brings the Terran sector under the benevolent shadow of the Concordat. Princess Charlotte, step forward." Charlotte stepped forward. The hall, packed with thousands of alien dignitaries and a pitifully small cluster of human diplomats, fell dead silent. You could hear the hum of the atmospheric recyclers working overtime. She didn't look at Caleb. She looked at her father. No. The word was quiet, but it dropped like a lead weight on the marble floor. King Frederick leaned forward, his joints popping with a sickening wet sound. "You will accept the pairing, Charlotte." "Father, I'll never choose a human mate," she snapped, turning finally to glare at Caleb. Her eyes were entirely black, devoid of sclera, reflecting his awkward, sweating form back at him. "Look at it. It is already perspiring. Its heart rate is erratic. I can smell its adrenal glands panicking from across the room. They are fragile. They are loud. They smell like decaying carbon. I will not bind my lineage to a species that hasn't even mastered its own biological responses." A low murmur rippled through the hall. The clicking of alien jewelry, the rustle of stiff fabrics. Caleb didn't feel a surge of patriotic indignation. He didn't want to draw a sword and defend Earth's honor. Honestly, he just felt his stomach sour. He wanted a cigarette. He wanted a cold shower. His left boot squeaked as he shifted his weight, a loud, rubbery sound that sliced through the murmurs and made his face burn hotter. He felt profoundly, deeply stupid standing there in his itchy wool pants. Ambassador Richard, standing in the human enclosure below the dais, cleared his throat. It was a nervous, wet sound. "Highness, I assure you, Lieutenant Caleb is in peak physical—" "Silence," Frederick commanded. He looked at his daughter. "This is not a matter of biological preference. It is statecraft." "Then find another statecraft," Charlotte retorted, stepping back into the shadows of the throne. I refuse. The Terrans are beneath us. Let them keep their shipping lanes closed. I would rather see the border burn than share a bed with an ape. The sheer silence that followed was suffocating. Caleb looked down at his white gloves. They were stained yellow at the seams from cheap manufacturing. Charlotte wasn't entirely wrong, he thought distantly. The whole affair was a cobbled-together mess. Humanity was desperately poor, technologically outmatched, and scraping the bottom of the barrel just to sit at this table. The ceremony, Frederick announced, his voice suddenly drained of its theatrical resonance, is suspended. Caleb exhaled slowly through his nose. He didn't wait for a formal dismissal. He just turned around. The polished marble floor stretched out before him, miles of it, flanked by thousands of eyes staring at the rejected human. He walked. Every third step, his boots squeaked. Squeak. Tap. Tap. Squeak. He kept his head down, focusing intensely on the intricate geometric patterns etched into the floor. He didn't feel like a martyr. He felt like a guy who had just been publicly fired from a job he didn't want in the first place. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall loomed closer. The air tasted stale. By the time he pushed through the doors and into the dimly lit antechamber, Ambassador Richard was already there, pacing aggressively, his face flushed purple. "Well," Richard spat, running a hand over his thinning hair. "That went spectacularly." Caleb unbuttoned his high collar, pulling the stiff fabric away from his raw neck. He took a deep breath of the cooler, unfiltered corridor air. "I told you she wouldn't go for it." "She doesn't have a choice," Richard hissed, looking around nervously as if the walls were bugged. They probably were. "The Concordat Parliament won't let her back out. The king is just indulging her temper. We have to pivot." "Pivot?" Caleb asked, stripping off his white gloves and shoving them into his pocket. "She just told 3 billion people I smell like rotting carbon. I don't think a bouquet of flowers is going to fix this, Rich." "You aren't going back to Earth, Caleb," Richard said, stopping his pacing to point a thick, trembling finger at him. "The treaty dictates you remain in her proximity until the pairing is finalized. If you leave, it's an act of war. You stay. You endure." Caleb closed his eyes. The headache he'd been fighting all morning finally bloomed behind his temples. "Great. Where do I sleep?" The human delegation's quarters were located on sub-level 4. It was an area designated for biologicals with high gravity requirements and low status profiles. It smelled like industrial solvent, stale coffee, and the faint, pervasive odor of mildew. Caleb sat on the edge of a narrow bunk, staring at the gray bulkhead opposite him. He had finally taken off the boots. His socks were damp. He rubbed his face with both hands, listening to the low, grinding vibration of the station's massive atmospheric processors rumbling beneath the floor plates. It was a chaotic, uneven rhythm that made his teeth ache. The door chimed. Before Caleb could answer, it slid open. General Miller stepped in, ducking his head to clear the low frame. Miller was a heavily scarred veteran of the Jupiter campaigns, a man who smelled perpetually of peppermints and old leather. "Put your boots back on, kid," Miller said, his voice a gravelly monotone. He tossed a standard-issue tactical rig onto the foot of Caleb's bed. Heavy canvas, ceramic plating, black webbing. Caleb stared at the rig. "I'm not a soldier anymore, General. I'm a diplomatic asset. Remember? The diplomatic asset just got reassigned," Miller said, leaning against the door frame and crossing his arms. King Frederick and Ambassador Richard reached a compromise to keep the treaty from dissolving. If Charlotte won't take you as a mate right now, she'll take you as a personal attaché, a bodyguard. Caleb let out a short, harsh laugh. A bodyguard? For a Concordat royal? She's got energy shields sewn into her dresses. What am I supposed to protect her from? A stiff breeze? You're supposed to protect our access to the Perseus arm, Miller replied, unsmiling. It's a humiliation tactic. She refused you as an equal, so her father is forcing you on her as a servant. It reminds her that she still has to swallow the human pill, and it keeps you in the palace. I have no training for Concordat security protocols, Caleb protested, picking up a heavy ceramic plate. The texture was rough, completely different from the smooth, pretentious fabrics of the ceremony. It felt real. You don't need training to stand outside a door and take shit from a teenager, Miller said. Get dressed. Your shift starts in 20. 20 minutes later, Caleb was standing in a corridor that looked drastically different from sub-level 4. This was the royal wing. The floor was a soft, spongy material that absorbed sound. The lighting was a warm, ambient gold that emanated from nowhere in particular. The air here smelled different, too. Crisp, like high-altitude snow, laced with a faint floral scent that made Caleb's nose itch. He stood to the right of Charlotte's massive, intricately carved chamber doors. A Concordat guardsman stood to the left. The alien guard was 7 feet tall, wearing sleek, frictionless armor, and hadn't blinked or acknowledged Caleb's existence since he arrived. Caleb shifted his weight. The tactical rig was heavy, pulling down on his shoulders. The synthetic undershirt was already clinging to his back. He felt entirely out of place, an ugly, blunt instrument left on a velvet pillow. The chamber doors slid open with a soft hiss. Princess Charlotte walked out. She had changed out of her ceremonial silks and was now wearing a tailored, high-collared tunic of deep crimson. She stopped, her black eyes locking on to Caleb. For a long second, neither spoke. Caleb didn't salute. He just looked back, feeling the heavy thud of his own heartbeat in his chest. "They sent you back," she said. Her voice was sharp, a knife scraping against glass. "Yes, Your Highness," Caleb said. His voice sounded flat, tired. "To guard me." She stepped closer. Up close, the floral scent was overpowering. Crushed ice, mint, and something bitterly sweet. "From what? You are a sluggish blunt force creature. If an assassin bypassed my shields, you wouldn't even have time to unholster your primitive kinetic weapon." "I'm just following orders, Highness," Caleb muttered, looking past her shoulder. He didn't want to engage. He just wanted the clock to run down so he could go back to his mildew-smelling room. "You have no pride," she whispered, a sneer twisting her pale features. "A proper being would have thrown themselves into the nearest airlock after such a public shaming. But humans, you just absorb the filth and ask for more." Caleb finally met her gaze. He felt a flicker of genuine irritation cut through the exhaustion. "We're stubborn. It's a flaw." She opened her mouth to snap a reply, but the ambient golden lights suddenly flickered. They didn't just dim, they strobed wildly, casting violent shadows down the length of the pristine corridor. Then a sound. It wasn't an alarm. It was a deep, structural groan, a horrific tearing noise that vibrated up through the spongy floor and rattled Caleb's teeth. The 7-foot Concordat guard stepped forward, reaching for a sleek energy rifle strapped to his back. "Atmospheric breach detected in sector..." The guard never finished the sentence. The wall behind him exploded inward. It wasn't a clean, cinematic explosion. It was a chaotic, deafening rupture of twisted metal, screaming pressure, and blinding dust. Caleb was thrown backward, his shoulder slamming hard into the carved door. The air was instantly sucked out of his lungs, replaced by a choking cloud of pulverized concrete and the sharp, toxic stench of electrical fires. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine. He hit the ground hard, scraping his chin on the floor. For a second, his brain disconnected. The world was just gray dust and the taste of blood in his mouth. Then instinct, ugly and unrefined, took over. Caleb scrambled to his hands and knees, coughing violently. The ambient light was gone, replaced by strobing red emergency klaxons. He looked up. The Concordat guard was gone, crushed beneath a massive section of collapsed bulkhead. Charlotte was on the floor a few feet away, clutching her chest, her eyes wide with a very unroyal panic. The blast had shorted out the microcircuitry in her clothes. Small sparks were snapping across her tunic, more tearing metal. The ceiling directly above her began to buckle. Caleb didn't think. He didn't make a heroic leap. He just launched himself forward, a messy, frantic tackle. He hit her hard around the waist, knocking the wind out of her with a sharp grunt. Their bodies tumbled across the spongy floor, just as a 2-ton structural beam crashed down exactly where she had been kneeling. They rolled into a heap against the far wall. Caleb was panting heavily, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He tasted copper. He smelled her crushed ice perfume, now masked by the stench of burning insulation. Charlotte pushed against his chest, her hands shaking, her breath coming in rapid, erratic gasps. The perfect composure was shattered. She was terrified. Caleb rolled off her, wincing as a sharp pain spiked up his bruised knee. He unholstered his kinetic weapon, the heavy steel pistol feeling cold and reassuring in his grip. He looked down at the princess, wiping a smear of blood off his chin with the back of his hand. "Still think I'm useless?" he rasped, coughing up dust. The emergency klaxons didn't wail, they pulsed. It was a low, guttural throb that vibrated in the marrow of Caleb's bones, a relentless rhythm demanding panic. He didn't panic, he just felt incredibly tired. Dust hung thick in the air, a gray, choking fog illuminated by the harsh red strobe of the emergency lights. It coated the back of his throat like ash. He hacked, spitting a glob of dark, gritty saliva onto the ruined floorboards. Beside him, Charlotte was frozen. She wasn't screaming. She was staring at the massive structural beam that had bisected the corridor, her black eyes wide, unblinking, and entirely hollow. The crushed ice scent of her perfume was gone, overwhelmed by the stench of burning polymers and ruptured coolant lines. "Hey!" Caleb shoved his pistol into its holster and grabbed her shoulder. The microcircuitry in her tunic was dead, the fabric now just heavy, useless silk. "Hey, Highness, look at me." She didn't move. Her breathing was a shallow, rapid flutter, like a dying bird. Caleb swore under his breath. He clamped his hand over the back of her neck, ignoring the sudden stiffness of her posture, and forced her head down between her knees. "Breathe. Deep breaths. The air scrubbers are down, and you're going to hyperventilate on toxic smoke." For a second she resisted, her alien pride fighting his crude grip. Then, her biology betrayed her. She gasped, a ragged, ugly sound, and leaned heavily into his hand. She was trembling. It wasn't a delicate cinematic shiver. It was a violent, full-body shake that rattled her teeth. "The guard," she choked out, her voice muffled against her knees. "Varn," Caleb looked over his shoulder. The 7-foot Concordat guardsman was a mangled mess beneath the collapsed bulkhead. There was no heroic final stand. The frictionless armor was cracked open like a beetle's shell, leaking a viscous pale blue fluid onto the spongy floor. The smell was sharp, like ammonia and old copper. "He's dead," Caleb said flatly. He didn't sugarcoat it. There was no point. He let go of her neck and crawled over to the crushed guard. His own left knee flared with hot, jagged pain every time he put weight on it. He gritted his teeth, feeling the sweat stinging the scrape on his chin. He reached under the rubble, his fingers slipping on the blue blood, and yanked the sleek energy rifle free from the dead man's maglock strap. It was lighter than it looked. Too light. It felt like a toy compared to the heavy steel of his kinetic pistol. He checked the power cell, fully charged. "This wasn't an accident," Charlotte whispered. She had lifted her head, her face smeared with gray dust, making her pale skin look almost corpse-like. "The palace shields, they are absolute. Nothing is absolute," Caleb grunted, tossing the rifle strap over his shoulder. He drew his pistol again. The heavy, mechanical click of the safety disengaging sounded obscenely loud in the ruined corridor. "Someone blew the western wall. That means they're coming through the western wall. We need to move." "Move where?" She stared at his weapon with a mixture of revulsion and desperate need. "The secure bunkers are in the lower vault, which is exactly where a hit squad is going to expect you to go," Caleb said, grabbing her upper arm and hauling her to her feet. She stumbled, her heavy skirts catching on a jagged piece of debris. He didn't wait for her to regain her balance. He just pulled. "We're going up. Service shafts, the environmental conduits." "I am not crawling through the ventilation system like a parasite." The aristocratic indignation flared, brief and entirely misplaced. Caleb stopped. He turned to face her, leaning in close. He smelled like sweat, blood, and cheap terrestrial combat rations. "You just told a galaxy I smell like rotting carbon. You think I care about your dignity right now? If we stay here, you die. If you run for the bunker, you die. You want to live? You crawl." Somewhere down the corridor, beyond the smoke and the wreckage, a heavy piece of metal clattered to the ground. Then, the distinct, rhythmic thud of boots. Not the soft padding of Concordat guards, heavy, magnetic boots, breaching gear. Charlotte heard it, the color drained completely from her lips. The indignation vanished, replaced by a raw, primal terror. "Right," Caleb muttered. "Let's go." He dragged her toward a maintenance panel he had spotted earlier during his agonizingly boring guard shift. It was locked with a biometric seal. Caleb didn't bother trying to hack it. He leveled his pistol at the center of the console and pulled the trigger. The sound in the enclosed hallway was deafening. It wasn't the neat surgical pew of an energy weapon. It was a concussive roar, a localized explosion of gunpowder and kinetic force. The heavy lead slug shattered the crystalline panel, sending sparks and shrapnel flying. Charlotte flinched violently, covering her ears. "Savage," she hissed, her voice ringing. "Effective," Caleb corrected, kicking the mangled panel door open. A blast of stale, freezing air hit them. The shaft was pitch black and smelled like ozone and rat droppings. "Ladies first," she hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking back at the billowing smoke where the heavy footsteps were growing louder. Then, Gathering her ruined silk skirts, the princess of the Concordat scrambled into the dark, dirty hole in the wall. Caleb squeezed in right behind her, pulling the bent panel shut just as the shadows of the strike team broke through the smoke. The environmental conduit was not designed for biological occupancy. It was a square, corrugated metal throat, freezing cold and slick with condensation. Every time Caleb bumped his injured knee against a rivet, a nauseating wave of pain rolled up his thigh. They crawled in total darkness for what felt like hours, guided only by the faint, icy draft of the recycler fans pulling air through the system. Charlotte moved ahead of him. She was surprisingly fast, her survival instincts overriding her complaints about the grime. The only sounds were the scraping of her silks, the heavy, ragged sound of Caleb's breathing, and the distant, muffled thuds of explosions rocking the palace. "Stop!" Caleb whispered harshly. Charlotte froze. Her foot, covered in a delicate, impractical slipper, was inches from his nose. "What?" she breathed back. Her voice was thin, reedy. "Vibrations." Caleb pressed his bare palm flat against the chilled metal floor of the shaft. He closed his eyes, tuning out the ringing in his ears from the gunshot. There it was. A rhythmic, metallic tapping. Someone was walking on the grating directly above them. "They're searching the grid," Caleb muttered. He awkwardly reached into one of his tactical pouches, fishing out a chemical glow stick. He cracked it, bathing the tight space in a sickly, pale green light. Charlotte looked back at him over her shoulder. In the green light, she looked feral. Her perfect hair was matted with dust, and there was a streak of black grease across her cheek. The disdain was gone, replaced by a desperate, searching look. She was waiting for him to tell her what to do. The ape was suddenly the captain. "Keep moving," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Slower. Don't scrape your clothes." They crept forward. The shaft began to incline, forcing them to pull themselves up by the corrugated ridges. Caleb's shoulder muscles screamed in protest. He was acutely aware of how vulnerable they were. If someone opened a grate above them and dropped a plasma grenade, it was over. No heroic shootout, just flash-fried meat in a tin can. The metal grating above them suddenly shifted. A sliver of harsh white light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Charlotte gasped, shrinking back against Caleb's chest. He instantly clamped a heavy, dirt-stained hand over her mouth. Her lips were cold. He could feel the frantic, fluttering pulse of her breath against his palm. Above them, a heavy boot stepped onto the grating. Then another. "Clear the sub-levels," a voice ordered. It wasn't speaking the elegant Concordat dialect. It was guttural, harsh, full of clicking consonants. Separatists. The splinter faction that opposed the Terran Treaty. They weren't just here to kill the king. They were here to erase the human variable. Caleb held his breath. His lungs burned. His hand remained clamped over Charlotte's mouth. She was rigid against him, her back pressed to his tactical rig. He could feel her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his arm. For a second, a bizarre thought crossed his mind. She doesn't feel alien right now. She just feels like a terrified kid. The boots lingered for a torturous 30 seconds, then moved on. The sliver of light dimmed as a door closed somewhere above. Caleb slowly removed his hand from her mouth. She inhaled sharply, a shaky, desperate breath, but she didn't speak. They crawled for another 10 minutes until the shaft widened into a junction box. It was big enough for them to crouch, though neither could stand fully. The air here was thicker, smelling of scorched grease and old rust. Caleb slumped against the cold metal wall, letting out a long, slow exhale. He unslung the alien energy rifle and laid it across his lap, then checked the magazine of his kinetic pistol. 6 rounds left. He was going to need more bullets. Charlotte huddled on the opposite side of the junction box, wrapping her arms around her knees. She stared at him. The green glow of the chemical light cast deep shadows beneath her eyes. "Why didn't you leave me?" she asked. The question dropped into the heavy silence, raw and unpolished. Caleb looked up, pausing in his weapon check. He wiped a mixture of sweat and grime from his forehead. "What?" "In the hall," she said, her voice shaking, losing its aristocratic cadence. "When the wall collapsed, I was paralyzed. You could have run to the bunker. You had the speed. You are accustomed to violence. You could have survived. Why did you tackle me?" Caleb stared at her. He thought about lying. He thought about saying something noble about duty, or the treaty, or Earth's honor. But he was too tired, his knee hurt too much, and his mouth tasted like ash. "Because I didn't think about it," he said honestly, his voice raspy. "It was instinct." She frowned, clearly confused. "Instinct? To protect a creature that humiliated you?" Caleb let out a short, humorless laugh. He leaned his head back against the grating. "Yeah, well, humans are stupid like that. We see something falling on someone, we try to push them out of the way. Doesn't matter if they called us an ape 5 minutes prior." "It is illogical," she whispered, looking down at her ruined hands. "It's biology," Caleb countered softly. He slid the magazine back into the pistol with a sharp clack. "You were complaining about our adrenal glands earlier. That's what they do. They make us move when smart people freeze." Charlotte didn't argue. She just pulled her knees tighter to her chest. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with the reality of their situation. The pristine, orderly universe she had known was burning above them, and her only anchor was the sweaty, bleeding, cynical primate sitting across from her. "My father," she said, her voice cracking for the first time. "Do you think he is—" "I don't know," Caleb cut her off. He didn't want to offer false hope. "But if they breach the royal wing, it's bad. We need to find an outgoing comms terminal that isn't hardwired to the palace mainframe. We need to signal the Terran fleet." Her head snapped up. "The Terran fleet? They are entirely outmatched by the Separatists' cruisers." "Maybe," Caleb grunted, using the wall to drag himself upright, grimacing as his knee popped. "But they're the only ones who actually give a damn if I live or die. And right now, Princess, my survival is your survival." The glow stick began to die 30 minutes later. The sickly green light dimmed to a pale, useless flicker, plunging the environmental shaft back into oppressive darkness. Caleb cursed softly, tossing the plastic tube aside. It clattered down the metallic incline, the sound echoing far longer than it should have. "How much further?" Charlotte asked. Her voice was right behind him, lacking its former aristocratic bite. She sounded exhausted. "Until we hit a vertical drop or a maintenance hatch," Caleb grunted, shifting his weight. His left knee was swelling against the tight fabric of his tactical pants. Every time he dragged it across the corrugated metal, a fresh wave of nausea rolled over him. "Watch your hands. There's a lip in the plating here." He heard the rustle of her ruined silk dress, followed by a sharp intake of breath as she scraped her palm. She didn't complain. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the distant, rhythmic thumping of the palace's life support systems, desperately trying to reroute air around the compromised sectors. The air in the shaft was growing warmer, losing that icy, sterile bite. It began to smell of heated copper and ozone, the distinct signature of heavy server banks. Caleb paused. He pressed his face against the cold grating beneath him. A faint amber light bled upward through the crosshatches. "Hold up," he whispered, holding a hand back in the dark. His fingers brushed against her shoulder, and she flinched, pulling away instantly. He ignored it. He unholstered his kinetic pistol, placing it gently on the metal floor to avoid any scraping sounds, and peered down through the grate. 10 feet below them lay a secondary communications hub. It was a utilitarian room, stripped of the marble and gold that decorated the upper levels. Naked fiber optic cables hung from the ceiling like exposed veins. In the center of the room, standing before a glowing server rack, was a separatist soldier. The soldier was tall, clad in the matte gray combat armor of the outer colonies. He was holding a thermal torch to the access panel of the main terminal, melting the biometric locks into slag. He wasn't Concordat elite, but he was heavily armed. A submachine gun hung on a magnetic sling across his back. "What is it?" Charlotte breathed, crawling up beside Caleb. She peered through the grate, her breath ghosting over Caleb's cheek. "A rebel. He's destroying the auxiliary relays," Caleb whispered back, "making sure nobody calls for help when the main tower falls." "Shoot him." Her command was blunt, cold. "I have 6 bullets left," Caleb muttered, his jaw tightening. "If I miss his vitals through this grating, he returns fire. Up here, we're fish in a barrel. The ricochets alone would shred us." "Then what is the primate strategy?" Caleb looked at her. In the faint amber light filtering up from the room below, her face was a mask of dirt and grease, but her black eyes were terrifyingly sharp. The panic from the hallway had receded, replaced by a cold, calculating survival instinct. "The primate strategy is gravity," Caleb said. He carefully holstered the heavy pistol and drew a 6-inch combat knife from his webbing. The blade was dull black, non-reflective. "I'm going to pop the grate. When I drop, I need you to stay up here until the room is clear. Do not make a sound." Charlotte looked from the knife to his swollen knee. "You are injured. Your mobility is compromised." "Noted," Caleb said dryly. He slid his fingers into the gaps of the grating, finding the manual release latches. He counted down from 3 in his head. 3, 2, 1. He twisted the latches. The grate swung downward with a heavy metallic groan. Caleb didn't hesitate. He dropped through the hole. The fall was only 10 feet, but to his ruined knee, it felt like 100. He landed hard on the reinforced plasticrete floor. His left leg buckled instantly, a blinding flash of white-hot pain shooting up his spine. The grunt that escaped his lips was loud and entirely unstealthy. The separatist soldier spun around, dropping the thermal torch. Caleb lunged forward off his good leg, driving his shoulder into the soldier's midsection before the alien could swing his submachine gun around. They crashed into the server rack, shattering the plastic casing. Sparks rained down on them. The alien was incredibly strong. A gauntleted fist slammed into the side of Caleb's head, knocking his vision sideways. He tasted copper. The room spun. He felt the soldier's heavy hands grasping for his throat. Caleb drove the hilt of his knife blindly into the soldier's helmet, but the ceramic armor absorbed the blow. The soldier shoved Caleb backward, Caleb hit the floor, sliding across the smooth surface. He scrambled, trying to get his feet under him, but his bad knees simply refused to hold his weight. He fell to his hands, gasping for air. The Separatist racked the bolt of his submachine gun, leveling the barrel at Caleb's chest. The alien let out a low, clicking laugh. Then, a heavy, metallic clang echoed through the room. The soldier stiffened. He dropped the gun, his hands flying to the back of his helmet. He swayed, completely silent, and collapsed forward onto the floor like a felled tree. Caleb blinked, trying to clear the blood from his right eye. Standing behind the unconscious soldier was Princess Charlotte. She was gripping a massive rusted pipe wrench in both hands, her knuckles white. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving against her torn crimson tunic. She stared down at the soldier, then looked up at Caleb. "I told you not to come down," Caleb coughed, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the floor. "Your gravity strategy was flawed," Charlotte said, her voice trembling slightly as she dropped the wrench. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. "You required assistance." Caleb dragged himself over to the server rack, using the mangled metal frame to pull himself upright. His head was throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache that kept time with his heartbeat. He looked at the Separatist soldier on the floor. The helmet was cracked down the middle. Thick, dark blood pooled on the plastic crete. He turned his gaze to Charlotte. She had backed away until her shoulders hit the far wall. She was staring at her hands. They were trembling violently. The pristine, untouchable royal had just bludgeoned a man from behind. Caleb limped over to the dead soldier and kicked the submachine gun away, just to be safe. He didn't offer her a platitude. He didn't tell her it was going to be okay. "First time?" he asked, his voice rough. She nodded slowly, unable to pull her eyes away from the spreading dark stain on the floor. "The Concordat. We do not engage in physical violence. We have castes for that. Drones, shields. I have never—" She swallowed hard, a sickly sound. It felt heavy. The bone. It cracked. "Yeah, it does that," Caleb said, leaning heavily against the console. He pulled a small, crushed medical kit from his webbing, ripping it open with his teeth. He pulled out a compression bandage. "You did what you had to do. Don't dwell on it. Dwell on it later, when we aren't getting shot at." He wrapped the tight elastic bandage around his knee, directly over his pants, pulling it so tight it made him grit his teeth. He needed the joint stabilized. Charlotte finally looked up. She watched him wrap his leg, her expression a mess of shock, disgust, and something entirely new: respect. "You are bleeding from your temple." "It's superficial," Caleb lied. He tied off the bandage and tested his weight. It still hurt like hell, but the joint felt less like it was going to bend backward. He hobbled over to the main terminal. The thermal torch had melted half the casing, but the primary interface was still intact. A blinking cursor sat mockingly on a black screen, demanding an administrative override. Caleb tapped the keys. Nothing happened. The terminal was locked in a localized quarantine mode. "I can't bypass this," Caleb muttered, dragging a hand through his sweat-soaked hair. "It's asking for a hard-coded royal cipher." The Separatists were trying to melt the physical hard drive because they couldn't hack the software. Charlotte pushed herself off the wall. She stepped carefully around the body on the floor, her eyes fixed firmly on the glowing terminal. She stood beside Caleb, the faint floral scent of her crushed perfume mixing strangely with the metallic smell of fresh blood. "Step aside," she ordered. Her voice was steadier now. The princess was back, but the arrogance had been sanded down to something far more practical. Caleb stepped back, keeping his kinetic pistol trained on the heavy steel door at the far end of the room. Charlotte placed her hands over the biometric scanner. The machine beeped angrily, flashing red. "The localized network is damaged," she murmured, her fingers flying across the physical keyboard with surprising speed. "They severed the fiber optics to the upper grid. I have to reroute the signal through the planetary weather satellites to bounce it back into the deep space bands." "Can you do it?" Caleb asked, checking the magazine on his pistol again. It was a nervous habit. "I am educated in orbital mechanics and network infrastructure," she said, not looking up from the screen. "Not just statecraft and silk weaving. Give me 2 minutes." "Take your time. Just do it before the next patrol walks through that door." The room fell quiet, save for the frantic clacking of the keyboard and the low hum of the servers. Caleb watched the door. He felt entirely out of his depth. He was a low-ranking officer, chosen for this diplomatic circus because he looked good in a uniform and had zero political ties. He was supposed to stand on a dais, smile, and eventually get dumped by a snobby alien princess. He wasn't supposed to be fighting a guerrilla war in a basement. "Got it!" Charlotte suddenly gasped. The terminal screen flared a bright, blinding white, then resolved into a standard Concordat communication array. "The uplink is active, but it is entirely unencrypted. Anyone listening will hear it." "Open the channel," Caleb said, limping to her side. She tapped a key. The screen displayed an audio waveform bar. Caleb leaned in. "This is Lieutenant Caleb, Terran Diplomatic Detachment. Priority 1 distress call. The Concordat Palace is under heavy attack by separatist forces. The king's status is unknown. I have Princess Charlotte. We are in the sub-level maintenance grid. Requesting immediate extraction." Static hissed back at them. The seconds stretched out, agonizingly slow. Caleb felt his stomach drop. Maybe the fleet had been pushed back. Maybe they were jamming the satellite bounce. Then a harsh, gravelly voice cut through the static. "Lieutenant, this is General Miller." Caleb let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Charlotte gripped the edge of the console, her knuckles white. "General," Caleb said. "What's the situation?" "It's a bloodbath up here, kid," Miller's voice crackled. 3 separatist cruisers dropped out of warp right on top of the orbital defense platforms. They're bombarding the city. We have 2 Terran frigates breaking atmosphere now, but the airspace is choked. "We need a dust-off," Caleb urged. "I am tracking your localized ping," Miller replied. "But I can't land a dropship near the palace. The anti-air batteries have been commandeered by the rebels. You need to get out of the city center. Get to the old industrial aqueducts on the southern edge. I can pull you out from there." Caleb closed his eyes. The southern edge was miles away, through a war zone, with a busted knee and a princess in a torn dress. "Copy that, General. We're moving south." "Caleb," Miller's voice dropped, losing its professional clip. "They know you broadcasted. Your signal just lit up every separatist scanner in that sector. They're going to converge on your position. Move fast. Miller out." The channel went dead. At the exact same moment, the heavy steel door at the end of the room shuddered violently. A loud metallic boom echoed through the chamber, followed by the high-pitched whine of a plasma torch cutting through the locks. Caleb looked at Charlotte. The green and amber lights of the terminal reflected in her dark eyes. "They found us," she whispered. "Yeah," Caleb said, raising his pistol. He stepped in front of her. "Stay behind me." A brilliant, blinding line of white heat etched its way through the heavy steel door. It hissed, a vicious, spitting sound that smelled of vaporized alloy and cooked ozone. The separatists weren't picking the lock. They were melting the hinges. "Back up," Caleb ordered, his voice tight. He pushed Charlotte behind the server rack, shielding her from the door. He didn't raise his kinetic pistol. 6 rounds of terrestrial lead weren't going to punch through heavy breaching armor. Instead, he unslung the Concordant energy rifle he had pulled from the dead guard in the hallway. The weapon felt alien in his grip, too smooth, lacking the reassuring heavy mechanical weight of human engineering. There was no iron sight, just a holographic reticle that projected directly onto his retina when he brought it to his shoulder. It made him slightly nauseous. The white-hot line completed its circuit. The massive steel door groaned, unsupported, and then crashed inward with a concussive boom that rattled the fillings in Caleb's teeth. Thick gray smoke poured into the communications hub. Caleb didn't wait for targets to present themselves. He aimed directly at the center of the smoke plume and pulled the trigger. The rifle didn't kick. There was no concussive explosion of gunpowder. It simply hummed, a high-pitched, tooth-aching vibration, and unleashed a torrent of searing blue plasma bolts. The rapid-fire discharge lit the room in a strobe of azure light. He heard a wet, heavy thud from the corridor, followed by a sharp scream that cut off abruptly. "Move!" Caleb yelled over the hum of the rifle. He grabbed Charlotte's arm, practically dragging her toward the secondary maintenance hatch at the rear of the hub. It was a smaller, circular iris door designed for ventilation drones. He slapped the manual override. The iris spun open with a rusty shriek, revealing a dark, sloping tunnel that smelled intensely of stagnant water and decaying biomatter. Charlotte didn't hesitate. The haughty princess who had scoffed at crawling was gone. She dove into the dark tunnel, her ruined silk skirts dragging through the grime. Caleb fired 3 more suppressing shots into the doorway, then threw himself into the hatch after her. He slammed his fist down on the interior locking mechanism. The iris spun shut, plunging them into total darkness just as heavy kinetic rounds hammered against the outside of the metal, sending dull, terrifying shock waves through the tunnel walls. They were sliding. The tunnel angled sharply downward, a slick algae-coated chute that dumped them unceremoniously into a shallow pool of freezing, foul-smelling water. Caleb hit the water sideways. His bad knee smashed against the submerged concrete floor. A sickening pop echoed in his ears, and his vision immediately tunneled into blackness. He went under, choking on liquid that tasted like rust and ammonia. Strong hands grabbed the collar of his tactical rig. He was hauled upward, breaking the surface with a loud, desperate gasp. He coughed violently, expelling the foul water from his lungs. Through the stinging haze in his eyes, he saw Charlotte standing over him. The water was up to her thighs. Her intricate braided hair had finally come undone, plastered to the side of her pale face in wet, heavy ropes. She looked completely exhausted, but her grip on his vest was iron tight. "Do not drown," she ordered, her voice lacking any regal inflection. It was just a raw demand. "You are the one with the map." "Noted," Caleb rasped, spitting a mouthful of bile into the water. He grabbed her forearm and used her leverage to drag himself upright. The pain in his leg was no longer a sharp spike. It had blossomed into a constant, roaring fire that consumed his entire left side. He leaned heavily against the damp, curved wall of the tunnel. They were in the primary runoff system. The walls were slick, black stone, arching 20 feet above them. The air was heavy, humid, and freezing cold. The only sound was the steady drip of water and the distant, muffled thud of orbital bombardments shaking the foundations of the city miles above. "We need to go south," Caleb said, his teeth chattering from the sudden temperature drop. He tapped a small, waterproof compass on his wrist interface. The faint green arrow pointed down the dark, curving tunnel. Charlotte looked down at him. She didn't let go of his vest. "Your leg is useless. You cannot walk the distance to the aqueducts." "I can walk," Caleb grunted, trying to take a step. His leg buckled instantly. He would have gone face first into the water again if Charlotte hadn't caught his weight. "You are irrational," she stated flatly. "Your biological structural integrity is compromised. A concordate drone would shut down to preserve processing power." "Well, I'm not a drone," Caleb panted, wrapping his arm around her shoulders without asking permission. He didn't have the luxury of protocol anymore. "I'm a stubborn ape. Be my crutch." She tensed for a fraction of a second beneath his weight. The proximity was a violation of every social custom her species possessed. To be touched by a human, to bear the weight of one, was unthinkable. But she didn't push him away. She adjusted her stance in the freezing water, sliding her arm around his waist, gripping his tactical belt to anchor him. "South," she said. They began to move. It was a slow, agonizing, three-legged shamble through the dark. Every step sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling over Caleb. He focused entirely on the rhythmic sloshing of the water against their legs. Slosh, drag, slosh, drag. "Why do you not vocalize the pain?" Charlotte asked after 20 minutes of grueling silence. "Screaming wastes oxygen," Caleb muttered, his chin resting near her shoulder. The floral scent of her perfume was completely gone, replaced by the smell of coal sweat and dirt. "It is fascinating," she said softly, her voice echoing off the curved stone. "You are so easily broken. No shields, no redundant organs, yet you persist. You are actively tearing the ligaments in your joint, and you simply continue to drag it." "It's called grit, Highness." "It is called insanity," she corrected, but there was no malice in it. "My father said humanity was a violent, unrefined species. He said you were a necessary evil for the shipping lanes. But he did not say you were this durable." Caleb managed a weak, breathy laugh. "We're hard to kill. It's our best quality." The subterranean transit felt like an eternity. The water level fluctuated, sometimes dropping to their ankles, sometimes rising to Caleb's chest, forcing him to keep the energy rifle held high above the murky surface. His muscles trembled with fatigue. The adrenaline had long since burned out, leaving only a cold, hollow exhaustion. He could feel Charlotte shivering against his side. The deep crimson tunic was soaked through, clinging to her like a second skin. Her body temperature felt wrong to him. Too cold, lacking the radiant heat a human would generate in the same situation. "We need to stop," Caleb slurred slightly. His lips felt numb. Just for a minute, he pulled away from her, leaning back against the rough stone wall. He slid down until he was sitting on a narrow, raised concrete maintenance ledge, pulling his ruined leg out of the freezing water. Charlotte didn't sit. She stood in front of him, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. The ambient light from Caleb's wrist compass cast a faint, sickly green glow over her features. She looked hollowed out. "We are behind schedule," she said, her teeth chattering. "The extraction." "Miller will wait," Caleb said, shutting his eyes. The darkness behind his eyelids spun. He knows I'm slow. Just give me 60 seconds. Let the blood pressure drop. He reached blindly into his web gear and pulled out a crushed waterproof foil packet. It was a high-calorie terrestrial ration bar. He tore it open with his teeth and held it out to her. Eat, he said. It tastes like sweetened cardboard, but it'll give your metabolism something to burn. She looked at the brown, compressed square with mild horror. I consume only synthesized nutrient solutions. Solid biological matter is... She trailed off, looking at his pale, sweating face. She reached out and took the bar. She took a small bite. Her face screwed up in immediate revulsion, but she chewed, swallowed, and forced down another bite. Foul, she choked out. Yeah, wait till you try our coffee, Caleb muttered, cracking one eye open. He watched her eat. She was standing in knee-deep sewage, her royal garments ruined, eating a piece of cheap human military surplus. The sheer absurdity of the situation hit him, and he let out a low, raspy chuckle. What is humorous? She demanded, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. 6 hours ago, you wouldn't even look at me because I was sweating on your marble floors, Caleb said, leaning his head back against the stone. Now you're eating my trash in a sewer. Statecraft is wild. She stopped chewing. For a long moment, she just stared at him. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of the day's violence. I was wrong, she said. The words were quiet, but they cut through the dripping water with absolute clarity. Caleb opened both eyes. About what? Your biological responses, Charlotte said, looking down at the half-eaten ration bar. I viewed your perspiration, your elevated heart rate, your adrenaline as flaws, evidence of an unevolved state. My people engineered those responses out of our genetic code millennia ago. We do not panic. We do not sweat. We simply exist in a state of controlled logic. She looked back up, meeting his gaze squarely. Her black eyes were wide, reflecting the faint green light. But when the wall fell, she continued, her voice trembling slightly, my logic offered no solution. Varn possessed frictionless armor and a tactical processing unit, and he died without moving a muscle. You panicked. You sweated. You threw yourself into the rubble. Your flaws kept us alive. Caleb didn't know what to say. He shifted uncomfortably, feeling the cold stone against his spine. We just adapt. We don't have fancy shields, so we have to move fast. You are not blunt force creatures, she said, stepping closer to the ledge. You are survivors. You are forged in the very dirt my people despise. I understand now why my father wanted this treaty. We need your dirt. We have become too brittle. She reached out, her pale, cold fingers gently brushing the dirt and dried blood from his forehead. It was a remarkably tender gesture from someone who had just clubbed a man to death an hour prior. Caleb swallowed hard. The touch sent a strange electric jolt through his exhaustion. Don't go falling in love with the ape now, princess. We still have to get out of this sewer. The corner of her mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest she had come all day. I make no promises regarding the ape, but I will tolerate the human. Good enough, Caleb grunted. He used his rifle as a cane, pushing himself painfully off the ledge. He swayed, the nausea hitting him in a massive wave, but he locked his jaw and gritted his teeth. Let's move. The aqueduct shouldn't be more than half a mile. They resumed their grueling pace. The tunnel began to widen. The smell of stagnant water slowly gave way to the sharp, chemical tang of industrial purifying agents. The sound of running water grew louder, transitioning from a localized slosh to a heavy, distant roar. "I hear it," Charlotte said, her voice lifting with a shred of actual hope. "The primary filtration reservoirs." "Yeah," Caleb muttered, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. The tunnel opened abruptly into a massive cavernous chamber. High above, faint strips of industrial lighting cast long intersecting shadows over massive concrete holding tanks and heavy steel catwalks. Water thundered from giant outflow pipes into the dark reservoirs below. They had reached the southern edge. Caleb pulled his radio off his belt. He hit the transmit button. "General Miller, this is Caleb. We are at the industrial aqueducts, awaiting extraction." He released the button and waited. Static hissed. Then a voice crackled through the speaker, but it wasn't Miller. It was guttural, harsh, and full of clicking consonants. "The Terran dropship has been redirected, Lieutenant. You have nowhere to run." Caleb's blood ran cold. He looked up. Standing on the catwalk 30 feet above them, illuminated by the harsh industrial lights, were 6 heavily armed separatist soldiers. They had their energy rifles trained directly on the water below. They were trapped. The red targeting lasers of 6 energy rifles cut through the humid air, painting Caleb's chest like a constellation of blood drops. Caleb didn't raise his hands. His heart hammered a brutal, frantic rhythm against his ribs. 6-1. From the high ground. The math was undeniably fatal. "Drop the weapon, Terran," the lead separatist voice echoed over the roar of the rushing water. "The princess comes with us." Charlotte stood her ground in the freezing sewage, her arm hovering near Caleb's tactical belt. The faint industrial light illuminated the sheer terror in her black eyes, but she didn't step away. "Do you trust me?" Caleb whispered. Charlotte didn't look at him. "No." "Good. Deep breath." Before she could process the words, Caleb shoved her violently backward. She hit the water with a heavy splash, going completely under the murky surface. Caleb didn't aim at the soldiers. He aimed the stolen Concordate rifle straight up at the massive rusted chain hoists holding a 50-ton filtration grate directly above the catwalk. He held the trigger down. The rifle whined, unleashing a continuous beam of searing blue plasma that melted the thick steel links in a fraction of a second. The massive chain snapped with a deafening thunderclap. The 50-ton iron grate plummeted, smashing into the catwalk. The horrifying shriek of tearing metal drowned out the return plasma fire. The entire section collapsed, sending 3 soldiers plummeting into the dark reservoir below, crushed beneath tons of twisted iron. The remaining 3 soldiers were thrown off their feet. Their plasma bolts went wild, scorching the concrete walls around Caleb. Caleb dove. The freezing water hit him like a physical blow. A stray plasma bolt struck the surface 2 feet away, flash boiling the liquid and sending a geyser of scalding steam over his back. He grunted, swallowing foul, chlorine-tasting water, and dragged himself blindly toward a thick concrete support pillar. His bad knee was a useless, dragging anchor. He broke the surface, gasping for air. Through the billowing steam, Charlotte surfaced nearby, coughing violently. Above them, the surviving separatists recovered. Harsh, clicking commands echoed. Red lasers swept through the thick steam. Caleb dropped the waterlogged plasma rifle. It was dead weight now. He unholstered his kinetic pistol. He wiped water from his eyes, leaving a streak of grease across his forehead, and pressed his back against the rough concrete. He leaned around the edge. A red laser instantly snapped to his cheek. Caleb fired twice. The concussive roar of the gun echoed deafeningly. The heavy lead slugs punched cleanly through the thin armor of the nearest separatist, who dropped without a sound into the water below. 4 bullets left. The remaining 2 soldiers laid down, suppressing fire. Blue plasma chewed into the concrete pillar, showering Caleb and Charlotte with burning shrapnel. The heat was unbearable. "Caleb!" Charlotte gasped, shrinking back. "I'm fine," he lied, his left arm completely numb from the scalding steam. He couldn't outgun them. He had to change the environment. He looked up. A massive, pressurized chemical purification pipe ran parallel to the surviving catwalk, painted bright yellow. He didn't think about the blast radius. He just aimed. He fired his remaining 4 rounds in rapid succession, placing the slugs in a tight cluster directly into the center of the pressurized pipe. The metal buckled. A hairline fracture spiderwebbed across the yellow paint. The pipe ruptured. A violent, high-pressure eruption of industrial purifying foam and pressurized gas blasted outward with the force of a hurricane. The 2 separatists were thrown like rag dolls against the far wall by the kinetic force. The chamber instantly filled with a thick, choking white fog. Caleb slumped against the pillar, dropping the empty pistol into the water. His hand shook uncontrollably. The chemical foam tasted bitterly of sulfur. Charlotte appeared through the white foam, kneeling beside him. Her ruined dress was covered in thick suds. She grabbed his face, her cold hands a stark contrast to his burning skin. "I am here," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You ruptured a primary chemical line. They are incapacitated." Before Caleb could reply, the heavy blast doors at the far end of the aqueduct exploded inward. Through the billowing foam, a massive blocky dropship hovered into the chamber. The side door slid open, revealing the scarred face of General Miller behind a heavy rotary cannon. "Lieutenant!" Miller's voice roared over the external speakers. "Need a lift?" Caleb let his head fall back, a harsh, broken laugh escaping his lips. "Took your time, General." 10 minutes later, they sat in the troop bay of the dropship. The engines vibrated with a deep, comforting hum as they broke atmosphere. Caleb was slumped against the bulkhead while a combat medic wrapped his knee in rigid biogel splints. He stared blankly at the metal floor, the adrenaline finally, completely draining from his system. He felt hollowed out. Charlotte sat opposite him, wrapped in a heavy thermal blanket. She had stripped off the ruined ceremonial silk, wearing only a plain gray synthetic undersuit. She looked nothing like a Concordat royal. She looked human. The clinical disgust was gone from her eyes. In its place was a quiet, heavy understanding. "The treaty," she said, softly over the roar of the engines. "My father is alive. Miller confirmed it. The Concordat will honor the agreement. The shipping lanes are yours." Caleb managed a weak nod. "Good. That was the job." "I told the galaxy you were a fragile, noisy creature," she continued, her black eyes locked onto his. "I told them you smelled of decaying carbon. I was incredibly foolish." Caleb leaned his head back against the cold steel bulkhead. He closed his eyes, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "It's all right, Highness," he whispered, letting the vibration of the ship lull him into the dark. "I do smell pretty bad right now." And just like that, the galaxy's most stubborn primate proved that sometimes human grit outshines alien perfection. Caleb didn't just survive, he completely rewrote the rules of the Concordat Treaty. If you loved this deep dive into raw, HFY survival and the evolution of Caleb and Charlotte's relationship, hit that like button. Share this story with your fellow sci-fi fans who know exactly what humanity is capable of when pushed to the absolute brink. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another epic sci-fi drama, and drop a comment below with your favorite action moment from the Aqueducts.